Now, many of you probably found that not so easy, and I think one of the main reasons we find these sorts of practices difficult is, again, this idea of emptiness is very profound and subtle, and that if we really want to penetrate this idea of emptiness in meditation, we need a very clear, calm and focused mind. So we need to improve our attention skills. So we need to engage in what's called the concentration practice or shamatha practice. Because that concentration or shamatha practice is helping us to improve the quality of our focus so that we can do this investigation in a better way. The analogy would be like a scientist who is trying to run an experiment, but the equipment they're using is faulty. It's not functioning very well. Then, of course, they can run the experiment many times and not really come up with any conclusive results. So similarly, the equipment of our mind is not functioning very well now because we're not very well focused. We're easily distracted, get dull, and therefore we can do this wisdom practice many, many times and not really get any results. So therefore, if we really want this emptiness practice to be more effective, we need the basis. We need functioning equipment. We need to work on our attention skills. We need to work on improving the quality of our attention, the concentration or shamatha practice. And if we can really put effort into that practice and bring that to this practice, I think you'll find it'll work a lot better. Now, there's probably a number of questions regarding this meditation, but maybe we can hold off on those now because I'm going to go into this meditation practice in more detail in this afternoon's session. So we'll leave the questions for now. So let's go back then to the Heart Sutra text. So remember, the Heart Sutra here is one of the perfection of wisdom teachings of the Buddha. The main topic here is this idea of emptiness, or in Sanskrit, shunyata. And it's called the Heart Sutra because it is the essence of all of these perfection of wisdom teachings on emptiness. It contains that essence in very few words. And so far we've had a look at the first two paragraphs, which is the prologue, the setting of the Heart Sutra, where did it take place and who was present and so forth. And so what we see is that it's taking place on a little hill called Vulture's Peak, just outside of Rajgir in modern-day Bihar, not far from Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. And we have the Buddha is sitting there, absorbed into emptiness, but at the same time is aware of everything that's going on around him. We have Avalokiteshvara is present also, who is a Buddha as well, but is appearing as a high-level bodhisattva. He's called an Arya Bodhisattva, which means someone who has directly realized emptiness. And he is also contemplating this idea of emptiness. And it said here that he saw that the five aggregates also are empty of inherent nature, meaning he saw that not just the person is empty of inherent nature, but the basis of the person, the body and the mind, i.e. the five aggregates, are also empty of inherent nature. So we'll have a look at these five aggregates shortly and what this word inherent nature means. So then we go to the subject matter of the sutra. So the next paragraph we have, it says, then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? So then it starts by saying, then through the power of Buddha. So what does that mean? So we said, of course, this is a sutra, which is, a sutra, of course, is a teaching of the Buddha, or in other words, the words of a Buddha. So the words of a Buddha can be of three types. So, of course, the words of a Buddha can be words that are directly spoken by the Buddha. Actually, if we look through the Heart Sutra here, very few of these words fall in this category. It's only right at the end we actually have the Buddha saying, well said, son of the lineage, and a few other words. So that's one type of words of the Buddha. And then there's another type is called which is words that are spoken on behalf of the Buddha, and that's actually particularly, for example, in the prologue, the setting of the sutra falls into this category, that someone is describing the setting of the sutra. And then we have a third category, and that is words of the Buddha that are directly inspired by the Buddha. And that's what it means here when it says, then through the power of Buddha. Through the power of Buddha means that, and here we have another person present, Shariputra. And so what we're going to see now is that we have Shariputra is asking a question to Avalokiteshvara. And then Avalokiteshvara is going to reply to him. And all of those words, that question-answer, are directly inspired. So through the power of the Buddha's mind, he's directly inspiring these Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara to have this question-answer session. So that is what it means by directly inspired, and that is what it means here by then through the power of Buddha. And then he says, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara. Shariputra is one of the two main disciples of the Buddha. Sometimes you see a picture or tanka of the Buddha, and then often you'll see standing either side of the Buddha are two disciples. They are the two main disciples of the Buddha. One of those is Shariputra, and the other one is Mogdhalyana. So they were the two main disciples of the Buddha. And here, Shariputra, it says Venerable Shariputra. So this word venerable often is a term used as a sign of respect, where maybe a junior monk is referring to a senior monk as venerable this, venerable that. But here the word venerable is coming from a Sanskrit word, ayusmant, and that Sanskrit word literally means someone endowed with life. And when we look at what does it mean, someone endowed with life, we mean a life free of the mental afflictions. So here this word ayusmant, referring to Shariputra, is saying that Shariputra has a life free of the mental afflictions. In other words, he has achieved nirvana. So he's what's called an arhat. So to the audience, he's appearing as an arhat, someone who's transcended suffering and achieved nirvana. And so Shariputra is asking then a question to Avalokiteshvara. And the question is, how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? So this word lineage is coming from the Sanskrit word gotra, and usually when we see this word lineage, we're talking about what's called naturally abiding lineage, which is another word for Buddha nature. But here, that's not what the word lineage is referring to. Here, we're talking about 3 types of lineage. And so remember earlier, when we talked about the Sanskrit title of the Heart Sutra, and we had the word Bhagavati, the TI was feminine, we said that wisdom is feminine. Because here, the main subject matter is the wisdom of emptiness, so therefore we have the feminine term here. And we said that the masculine term is used for the method wing of practice. And that is what we're talking about lineage here. Lineage is talking about ways of approaching the practice, the different methods. And so often you find that we talk about 3 main types of way of approaching practice. The first one is called in Sanskrit Shravaka, which usually is translated in English as hearer's lineage. So someone following this approach to practice, as the name suggests, as a teacher, they hear instructions from the teacher and they follow the teacher's instructions to achieve the goal of nirvana. So they're constantly having this way of practicing, hearing and practicing. Then we have another way of following the practice. Which is called the Pratyeka Buddha lineage. And often this is translated into English as solitary realizer. This person, of course, needs to initially listen to some instructions. They start practicing, but then later they go off into solitude to complete the path on their own. That's why they're called solitary realizer. So this is a different way of approaching the practice. Both of these types of practitioner have their goal is nirvana, meaning personal liberation from suffering. Then we have the other third way of following the practice, and that is the bodhisattva lineage. And so a bodhisattva, of course, is striving for the goal of enlightenment. So here in the text, when Shariputra is asking, how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? So when he says, how should any son of the lineage train, he's referring to himself. So he's calling himself son of the lineage. And son of the lineage here means son of the bodhisattva lineage. And you become a son or daughter or child of the bodhisattva lineage when you awaken that lineage. Meaning, in other words, when you develop great compassion. So when you develop great compassion and you aspire to follow the path to enlightenment, you have awakened your Mahayana lineage or Bodhisattva lineage. And then you're called son or daughter of the lineage. So Shariputra is indicating here that he's developed great compassion and he wants to follow the Mahayana path to enlightenment. So how should he train if he wants to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? In other words, the profound perfection of wisdom is the wisdom of emptiness. So basically, Shariputra is asking, how should anyone who has developed great compassion and is aspiring to follow the path to enlightenment, how should they train in this wisdom of emptiness? This is the question he's asking. Any questions about that? Anything not clear? A lot to be said on that, but I'll sort of keep it brief. Is emptiness a sort of solitary thing for nirvana? Is that more or less the question? Right. So we've basically said that nirvana is sort of like a stepping stone to enlightenment. This is personal liberation from suffering. This is then the further goal of enlightenment so we can help to liberate everyone else. In striving for both of those, we need the two wings of wisdom and compassion. Now, I mentioned briefly that from all the various teachings of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, Buddha nature, emptiness and so forth, from that we have a lot of philosophical systems evolving in India. And most of those philosophical systems are really coming from the Four Noble Truths. And there it said that if we want to achieve nirvana, what we need to do is realize no self. So in these systems, they don't talk about emptiness at all, really. They just say, realize no self, you can achieve nirvana. And also, they don't really talk about this. Whereas here, based on this perfection of wisdom teachings, the second wheel, we hear about the further goal of enlightenment. And here, it said we need to realize emptiness to achieve this. But actually, if you look closely, this teaching is also saying, actually, to achieve nirvana, you also need emptiness. But whether you're striving into nirvana or enlightenment, you need both wings. You need wisdom and compassion. Because if you don't have both wings, you won't get anywhere near these. Because if we're trying to develop this wisdom of emptiness, and we don't have loving kindness or compassion, you're not going to get very far. You need to conjoin emptiness with wisdom and compassion, then we can achieve nirvana. And then if we take the wisdom and compassion to the next level of bodhicitta, and join that with emptiness, we can go to enlightenment. So this is what's being said, but there's a lot more to talk about here. Right. Oh, yeah.
Did Shavaka, the ways of Shavaka and Buddha formed also schools?
Each of these lineages, of course, here we need to understand the difference between a philosophical system and a practitioner. A practitioner uses a particular philosophical system as their basis, and that philosophical system may or may not be the deepest understanding. But whatever philosophical system they start with, if it happens to be a bit limited, they will transcend that and go to the deepest understanding. So generally, generally the Shravaka and Pratyeka Buddha would start out with what's called a sort of a Vaibhashika or Sautrantika philosophical system as their basis, this idea. But what we're looking at here, based on what's called the Madhyamika philosophical system, they would say that if you're a Shravaka Pratyeka Buddha and you start out with this idea, you're not going to get to Nirvana. You will get there and you'll realize, oh, there's something more I have to do. Then you will come to understand emptiness, and then eventually you realize emptiness and you will achieve the goal of Nirvana. We're going to talk about that. So a brief answer is that these types of practitioner, based on the philosophical system that came from the Four Noble Truths, generally the assertion is that the only person in the history of this planet who achieved enlightenment was Prince Siddhartha. One person. For us, not possible. Too difficult. We can achieve this goal. And so then they start the path with this as the goal. This perfection of wisdom teachings, and particularly the third turning, the Buddha nature, actually says, no, everyone has the possibility of achieving enlightenment. So there's a difference there. Will it automatically lead to that? No. Is it a good basis to help us to understand emptiness? Of course, yes. Of course, yes. Yeah. Okay. So let's now have a look at Avalokiteshvara's response to this question. And before we go to the Heart Sutra, let's again go to this mind map and have a look at how his answer is structured. So we see that he gives quite an extensive answer, and his answer is divided up into a number of sections. And the first part, it talks about inferior faculties, which is another word for just his answer for normal people. And here we see it divided over 4 or 5 parts. We see it, there's a path of accumulation and preparation, path of seeing, path of meditation, path of no more learning. So what we see is that Avalokiteshvara's reply is related to the various stages of the path. How do we practice this wisdom of emptiness over the various stages of the path to enlightenment? And so that's how we're going to look at the answer. And the various stages we see on the next page, the Mahayana path. We see that it's divided into 5 parts or 5 stages. So the Mahayana path, of course, is the path to enlightenment. And we see it's divided into these 5 stages. Path of accumulation, path of preparation, path of seeing, path of meditation, path of no more learning. So what we see is that the first part of Avalokiteshvara's reply is related to how to practice this wisdom of emptiness over the first 2 stages of the path. Path of accumulation, path of preparation. So, of course, implicitly, it's also then describing how we as a beginner are to practice this wisdom of emptiness. And so we'll look at how to do that shortly. Just 1 or 2 things from this chart now, and then we'll keep looking at it in various times today and tomorrow. We see that to enter the Mahayana path, to enter this path of accumulation, we look at the bottom, there's a number 2, and number 2 says uncontrived renunciation and bodhicitta. So again, to enter the Mahayana path, we have to develop this aspiration of bodhicitta, the aspiration for enlightenment. So then we become a bodhisattva and we enter the Mahayana path. So let's have a look at how we are to practice this wisdom of emptiness on the initial stages of the path. And of course this instruction then is also relevant for us as beginners. So he says the following. He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this. So remember again, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage is talking about anyone who has developed great compassion and is now aspiring to follow the path to enlightenment. How should they practice this wisdom of emptiness? And so the short answer we see in the next line, it says, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. So again, in his brief answer, he's reaffirming what we saw in the prologue, and that is that we are to see the five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. In other words, not only the person is empty of inherent nature, but the body and mind are empty of inherent nature. So before we look at what does this word correctly and repeatedly mean, let's have a look at this presentation of the five aggregates. Because this presentation on the five aggregates comes up a lot in Buddhist teaching, so it's a good idea to know what they are. And the Sanskrit word here for aggregate is skanda. And skanda literally means pile or heap. That the person is made up of five heaps of things or five piles of things. That's what the word aggregate means, or skanda.
Are they mentioned in the first will?
Yes. Yes. Now, the person, so here, these five aggregates normally is a presentation of the basis of the person. What are the parts of the person? And of course, very simply, we can say the person has a body and a mind. And so the first aggregate is what's called the form aggregate. And of course, that is referring to the body, the physical aspect of the person. The mind can be divided up in many ways. Here, we have the mind being divided up into what's called main mind and mental factors. So we divide the mind into two parts, two aspects, main mind, mental factors. Main mind, and so this division is from the perspective of how our mind functions in our experiences. In our experiences, we initially simply contact the object itself. And that initial contact with the object itself is the main mind. But then when we contact an object, we have a certain type of experience of that object. And the mental factors, the various mental factors, will determine what type of experience we have of that object. So here we're really talking about Buddhist psychology, and in mental factors here, we often have a list of 51. You could make a list of hundreds if you wish, but generally here we see a list of 51 mental factors to describe various important aspects of experience. So, for example, one mental factor here that is very important is mindfulness, which means if our mindfulness is not really operating, we may come into contact with an object and we don't even notice it because we're off somewhere else. Many of these mental factors here, in fact more than half, in fact 26 of the 51 are mental afflictions, such as anger, jealousy, craving, all of these mental afflictions. So what it seems to suggest is that in our experience of things, often mental afflictions are present and create problems, of course, in our experiences. But here in this list of mental factors, in terms of the 5 aggregates, there are 2 mental factors very important. And the first one of those is feeling. Feeling is a translation of the Sanskrit word Vedana. And so here's another example of how terminology can be confusing. Because often in English, when we use the word feeling, we mean emotion. If you see the word feeling in Buddhism, it does not mean emotion. Feeling is a mental factor which is simply our experiencing things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The reason this gets a lot of attention is that this mental factor gets us into a lot of trouble, often. Because when we have a pleasant feeling or experience, we have a lot of craving and attachment. And when we have an unpleasant feeling, we have a lot of aversion, which can lead to all sorts of things. So feeling really often gets us a lot into trouble. So therefore, in the 5 aggregates, this is taken out of here and listed separately. To really highlight the fact that this mental factor, we need to pay close attention because it gets us into a lot of trouble. There is another mental factor here that gets us also into a lot of trouble. Which is often translated into English as discrimination, or sometimes, and the original Sanskrit word is samsha, sometimes it's translated as discernment. This mental factor is our ability to distinguish one thing from another. Which means if we can't accurately and clearly distinguish things, we get into trouble. So therefore, this mental factor is very important as well, because it's often on the basis of not clearly distinguishing things that we respond and react in inappropriate ways in a lot of problems. So these 2 mental factors are the basis of a lot of our problems and suffering. So they're taken out and listed separately here to really highlight this. Discrimination, or samjña in Sanskrit. Sometimes this is translated as discernment. it's our ability to distinguish things clearly and accurately. If we don't do that, if we don't clearly distinguish things, then we often react in inappropriate ways, of course. We're not seeing it accurately. Then the fourth one is then all the other mental factors apart from that. So then the mental factors is the fourth one. Which often is translated into English as compositional factors. The Sanskrit word is samskara. And the reason it's called compositional factors is that these mental factors, depending on which ones are present in our experience, are literally composing or forming what our future is going to look like in terms of our behaviour and our experiences. That's why they're called compositional factors. The Sanskrit is samskara. Any of you, of course, have done a Goenka retreat. Any of you have done a Goenka retreat, he uses this word a lot. And he calls this the reactive mind. Because generally here, in our mental factors, it's our mental afflictions where we react to certain things and we get into a lot of trouble. And then the fifth aggregate is simply the main mind, what's left over.
So the 2, 3, 4 are all belong to the mental factors?
Yeah, so the fifth aggregate is often translated as consciousness, in Sanskrit, Vijnana. So what we have is 2, 3, and 4 are the mental factors, and 5 is the main mind. So 2 to 5 all together is the mind. So basically, the 5 aggregates are the body and the mind. But usually it's divided up like this. Compositional factors is simply all the mental factors all the rest of the mental factors after we've taken out feeling and discrimination. Why it's called that is that these mental factors, depending on which ones are present in our experience, are composing or forming what our future is going to look like. Because, for example, if we have a lot of anger, that's going to compose a lot of suffering for ourselves and the people around us, if that's present in our experiences. Yeah. Any more questions about 5 aggregates? So the mind can be divided up in many ways. You can divide the mind, like one way of dividing up the mind, you can talk about the 6 consciousnesses, the mental consciousness and the 5 sense consciousnesses. And you can divide it many ways. The way we're dividing it here is into 2, into main mind and mental factors. That's division. And main mind, and this division is in terms of how the mind functions in our experiences. And in our experiences, we initially contact the object, and that initial sort of raw experience of the object is the main mind. And then and then the mental factors fill in the experience, what type of experience we have of that object. And we see here that in these mental factors, these 2, feeling and discrimination, are very important because they get us into a lot of trouble. That's why they're listed separately, just to highlight that. These, of course, they're not 2 separate things. You can't separate them. You can't have main mind here, mental factors here. They are aspects of the experience. It's a way of talking about single experience, a meaningful way to break that down that makes sense. Yeah, it's not like main mind here, mental factors here. You can't have one without the other. You know, it's like Like if we wanted to talk about the pen, we can talk about the colour and the shape of the pen. You can't have the colour of the pen here and the shape of the pen over there, but colour and shape together is a good way of talking about the pen. Right? Saying, a good way of talking about the mind is breaking it into main mind mental factors, like colour and shape of pen, because it helps to understand the pen better.
Can you say a little bit more about discrimination?
Yeah. So discrimination, again, another way that this is translated is discernment. So this mental factor is simply our ability to distinguish one thing from another, to correctly distinguish. So if I'm looking here, the mental factor of discrimination would go pen. You know, if my mental factor of discrimination wasn't functioning very well, I may say, you know, anything, cat. I mean, that's not going to be helpful in the way I interact if I don't see this clearly as a pen. If I discern or discriminate it differently as some other object, then the way I interact will be probably difficult, it will cause problems.
Once again, about the main mind and the mental factors. The main mind is like some kind of raw
experience, yeah.
of something without judgments. No, what exactly?
You can't have this without this. In here, there are some of these that are present in every single experience. For example, feeling. You can't have a raw experience without feeling. It has to be there. So it's not like this, then comes this. It's all happening together, but this is a good way of understanding how our experience works. Like understanding the pen, it could be useful to talk about the colour and the shape of the pen. Those two things together help us to better understand what a pen is. So these are two aspects of experience. It's not like we have this and then this follows.
But I'm trying to get a better grasp of the main mind.
So yeah, a main mind is not something separate. Main mind is simply the raw experience of the object. But with that raw experience, it always comes together with mental factors.
So we have the control of the mental factors. We can work on our no, I mean
Control.
we wish like
Yeah, there are some mental factors that we can, and that's what we're trying to do in this list. There are what's called the mental afflictions, but there are also positive mental factors, you know, like loving kindness, compassion, and so forth. So these ones we're trying to either reduce and eliminate or develop. Like mindfulness is a mental factor. We're trying to develop that, to increase it.
You mentioned about the feelings, which is described pleasant, unpleasant,
Pleasant, neutral.
Right. So how is related to the mind? How is this process? Like in the mind, if let's say I have like any experience,
Then that experience will. No, not interpreting. It's not a choice.
How do you know what is choice or not choice for me? It depends on my experience because some.
You see that you have an initial experience of something, and with that comes either a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral experience. You have no choice in that. You have a choice in what you do with that. That's why this is here. We have a choice in how we respond to that. Normally or often we don't respond in a very good way. If we have a pleasant thing, we go, I want, I want, I want. Unpleasant, go away, go away, go away. That's how we react, usually. But yes, we have a choice in what we do with that, how we respond to it.
Can you give any recommendations what you do with it? Better one?
It's coming. Right.